coming out this afternoon. What I'd like to do is speak for a while and then entertain as many questions as you would like to ask about the subjects that I'm going to be talking about. So thanks to John Boynton, who invited me to do this, and to Jill, to Steve, and to our AV expert in the back there. Thank you all. I've invested my long career on the edges of academe, so I've entitled my remarks today, Riding the Wild Edges of Academic Life. When I graduated from high school, I wanted to do something adventurous. I was more adventurous than studious at that point in my life. Perhaps I still am, I hope, a bit anyway. And so I had planned to buy a car, drive it up the Alcan Highway, enroll as a geology student at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, sell the car to pay the tuition, and go from there. Well, I never got to Alaska. I never studied geology because what intervened was an invitation to attend Deep Springs College in California. Deep Springs, can you hear me all right in the back? Everything's working, good. So I had heard about Deep Springs from a friend in Dayton, Ohio, where I grew up. And it is a college extremely small in scale, located on a cattle ranch or along the California-Nevada border. And it had been founded in 1917 by a man named L.L. Nunn, about whom I'll tell you a bit more. But the students at Deep Springs study liberal arts and sciences curriculum for 2 years. It's a junior college only. And they work a regular cattle ranch out in a remote area and handle almost all of the other duties and responsibilities required to maintain and run the college. And this appealed to me in a big way because I had a grandfather who was a small-scale rancher in Colorado. And as I was growing up, the most exciting things that happened in my life were the road trips from Dayton, Ohio to Loveland, Colorado, where we spent a couple of weeks on that little ranch. So Deep Springs just appealed to me from the beginning, and the only question was, could I be lucky enough to get admitted? So what happened was, of course, that I was ready to go to the University of Alaska when I got the surprise letter from the admissions committee at Deep Springs saying that I had been admitted as a student there. So I changed my plans, sold the car I had bought to drive up the Alcan Highway, saved my money, got on the train. That was the last train trip I took and traveled to California to enroll at Deep Springs. So I want to tell you a little bit about this college, but first I want to talk about what I regard as the pleasures of working on the edges of institutions rather than in the center. And I can't say that these quotations inspired me to do what I did, but I would say that they frame what I've done with much of my career in a rather important way. I think they're very apt. So the first was advice given to historian Juanita Brooks by her father about being a nonconformist as she was doing her groundbreaking work writing the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And this is what he told his daughter. She was then, I think, probably in her late 30s. "My girl, if you will follow this tendency to criticize, I am afraid that you will talk yourself right out of the church." He was concerned she was going to leave the LDS church. That's irrelevant to the main part of this comment. "I hate to see you do that. I'm a cowboy. And I've learned that if I ride in the herd, I am lost, totally helpless. One who rides counter to it is trampled and killed. And one who trails behind means little because he is leaving all of the work to others. It is the cowboy who rides the edge of the herd, who sings and calls and makes himself heard, who helps direct the course. Happy sounds are generally better than cursing, but there are times when he must swear a little and swing a whip or a lariat to round in a stray or turn the leaders. So don't lose yourself and ride off and desert the outfit. Ride the edge of the herd and be alert, but know your direction and call out loud and clear. Chances are you won't make a difference," he told his daughter, "but then again, you just might." The other one is a phrase that we've often heard from Finley Peter Dunn about the task of a newspaper, when he said it was the task of newspapers to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. We've all heard that phrase, and I love it. And it's had something to do with my career and my devotion to teaching in higher education. So in 1956, when I went off to Deep Springs, I was about as excited as a young man could be, and I didn't find out until after I got there much of the backstory as to how this college came about. Lucian L. Nunn spent much of the heart of his life in Utah. He had been born and raised in Ohio and came west like Frederick Remington, Teddy Roosevelt, and others to test his mettle against the Wild West. And he ended up in Telluride, Colorado when the plat of the city was only being laid out. And he had tried his hand at carpentry, he had tried his hand at a number of things, and volunteered himself because he thought he could run mines better than some of the ones that he saw there in Telluride. And so he volunteered himself and was able to get a job as a mine operator. He did this for a few years and decided why should he work for others? He would just as soon found his own mines and be his own boss. And so he founded a couple of mines in the Telluride, Colorado area in the early days. This worked out rather well for a while, but there were labor problems that cropped up, and before long, the wood from the hillsides, chopping down trees, both to make the timbers for the mines as well as to burn for running the stamp mills, the steam engines that crushed the ore, Telluride ran out of fuel. They had burned up all the available trees that were close by, and now they were faced with real serious difficulties. So in the winter of 1889-90, most of the others there were wringing their hands about losing all of their investments, but Nunn, still a young man in his late 20s, began to think about what other sources of power could we find. He was a restless intellect, and he had been reading about Nikola Tesla's experiments with alternating current, challenging Edison's direct current technology. And the reason that this was important is that direct current was only possible, made it only possible to transmit electricity a short distance because it heats up the wires. And alternating current doesn't do that, particularly at high voltage. So as early as the late 1880s, many of the establishments in downtown Salt Lake City had the electric lights. But using electricity for power meant having the generation of power where you had a big difference, waterfalls, or a big difference in the elevation of water, and where you could generate that power and then run it by wire to the places where you wanted to use the power. So we had been limited throughout all of human history to generating whatever power we could very close to the same site where you would use the power. So the water wheel is, of course, the best example. You would build a water wheel and on a stream, and then you had to take the lumber there in order to saw it in the sawmill, or you had to take the grain there in order to render it, in order to change the raw wheat into grain and flour. And so Nunn's speculation was, what if I were able to get together with Nikola Tesla in order to find a way to harness the power that was in these streams cascading down off the mountains around Telluride, Colorado, and use that power to run the stamp mills. This would save my businesses. And by the way, by this time he was already the owner of the first bank in Telluride. He owned one of the two newspapers in Telluride. This was a young man on fire. So he found out that George Westinghouse in Pittsburgh was working with Tesla to develop the practical application of Tesla's theories. And so in that winter of 1889-90, Nunn got on the train, went to Pittsburgh, introduced himself to George Westinghouse and said, I have an idea, and I know you're experimenting with it with the alternating current to challenge Thomas Edison. And he said, I'm the one who can set up the experiment to see if this will work. And George Westinghouse was immediately smitten by this idea. And he said, let's take this to my board. And so a few days later, he took Nunn to the board meeting, and Nunn presented his idea. And he was, by the way, about 5'2", and still quite young. And the board basically laughed at him just the way you were laughing at the image as I described it. And so after he made his pitch, the board said, thumbs down. They were not willing to take a chance on this. Way out in Telluride, Colorado, after all. And so as they left the room, Westinghouse said, why don't you come by my office? And he did. And Westinghouse said, I think you've got something here. And he said, I'd like to work with you on this myself if the board is unwilling, and therefore I will put up the money for my side of the bargain in order to advance this experiment that you have in mind. So Nunn went back to Colorado in the dead of winter that year And his task was to build a dam, to build penstocks to take the water down to a power plant, to acquire a Pelton wheel large enough to drive what they believed would be a 100 horsepower generator, and to string power lines 2.5 miles from where this power plant would be to his Gold King mine, which producing quite well, but did not have a way of rendering the ore. So while he was doing this, George Westinghouse was creating the world's largest alternating current motor by far, a 100 horsepower motor and a 100 horsepower generator, and shipped them out to Nunn in May in 1890, and took the motor at great labor up into the mountains to the Gold King mine, installed the generator down with the penstock, and on a June day, they cranked up the Pelton wheel by letting the water come down the penstock, and then they had a huge knife switch, and Nunn himself threw the switch to close the circuit. There was an arc, went across there about 2.5 feet, blinding, scared everybody to death, but it closed the circuit. They had a telegraph machine that linked the powerhouse to the Gold King mine operation, and all just within seconds, the operator up there clicked down the message to them that the electric motor had leaped into action. Still makes my spine tingle to think about this is the first time in world history that such an experiment had taken place. So you could generate power one place and use it someplace else, even though it was only 2.5 miles. Now the experiment was so frightening, closing that knife switch, that they let the thing run for a month before anybody dared to open the switch again because they knew they would get the same arc. But they finally cranked up their courage and did that, and before long, Nunn's mine was operating on electricity, and you know what happens next. Everybody else in the area wanted him to build a power plant like his, and so they could operate their mines in the same way. They all were operating in areas where there were rushing streams close to where the mines were, but not, of course, next to them because the mines are generally high in the mountains. So Nunn's original plan as he began to switch over to become an entrepreneur in hydropower was that he could take the many workers that he had in his mines and just redeploy them to work in his power plants. But as we all know, young people have a knack for running computers that we don't. They've grown up with this stuff, they pick it up very quickly, and Nunn found that he couldn't just take his miners and have them run power plants. Electricity was very complicated technology, particularly at that time when almost all of the synchronization of the voltages had to be done by hand. And so he ended up discovering that what he really needed to do was find high school students just as they were graduating from high school. They were bright, invite them to come as apprentices to work in his power plants, which he was beginning now to disseminate more widely across the West. And these young people, he discovered, were very adept at doing complicated technical skills which others lacked. So now he had a new problem. He had moved to Utah. He had sent out some of his best colleagues to find places where there was going to be demand in the valleys. There was a lot of snow in the mountains, and he could therefore establish his hydroelectric power on a much larger scale. So he chose Utah, and specifically he chose the power plant that is still at the mouth of Provo Canyon in Utah Valley. And he built first the power plant known as Nunn's, only the remnants of which are still there. And then when there was more demand, he moved downstream a couple of miles and built the power plant, which is not the steam power plant just as you're approaching the canyon mouth at Provo Canyon, but just as you enter the canyon itself, there's a large penstock that has come down off the side of the mountain for over a century when Nunn built his power plant there, which at the time it was opened in 1904 and for the next half a dozen years was the most advanced, most powerful hydroelectric plant in the world. People came from all over the world as this new technology was spreading and said, how can we do this? And they wanted to see what he had done there. So, and the power, by the way, was directed about 30 miles out across the desert to the west from Provo Canyon to the town of Mercer. And you probably are aware that Mercer was the site of a very active mining community at the time, and it has since become a ghost town. But that power they were transmitting over a very large number of miles at the time. So Nunn it was now establishing an empire of hydroelectric plants, and he was looking for bright young men who would be able to run these power plants for him. And he realized that they needed education, and so he established this apprentice system at his home power plant at the one there at the mouth of Provo Canyon. And the first year, the students would work full-time. And then the ones that were doing particularly well, the second year, he'd have them work half-time, and he would hire professors from the University of Utah and other higher education institutions in the area to tutor the students on the half of the day that they were studying instead of doing their work. If they did well at that, during the third year, they became full-time students. And if they did well at that, they had now completed the equivalent of about 2 years of college work. And he then said, now I will personally send you, pay your tuition, to attend any college or university in the U.S., particularly those that have good electrical engineering programs. And as he was doing this, Nunn was also discovering that he had these young men who were running power plants in Beaver, way up Beaver Canyon, the Hercules power plant at the mouth of the canyon in Logan, Utah, and elsewhere. And it was expensive to have adult supervisors for these young men, and so he ended up saying, what I need to do is teach them to be self-governing. So he began to transfer his educational mission from technical hydro things, also including that, but he became more and more interested in teaching them philosophy, political science, history, so that he could put them into these remote places and have them be able to govern their own affairs. So by the time a decade had passed, Nunn had lost interest in hydropower altogether, and he was absolutely consumed with his experiments in educating young men. So he ended up selling his power plant to what became Utah Power and Light, and founding Deep Springs College in California. At that time, he was in his 60s, he had tuberculosis, he was dying, and he wanted somehow to make his last mark in education. So Deep Springs was founded on this philosophy. He said, I want students to have the same practical experience that they've had in my power plants, but I want them to not necessarily run power plants, because he realized that the technology was changing so rapidly that there would not be the need for as many workers for very long. But he was inspired by the idea that if students at a young age are doing practical jobs with a high degree of independence and responsibility, they grew and matured very rapidly. So Deep Springs, founded in 1917, still in operation today. It's the 101st year right now. And it is located on a working cattle ranch in a valley all by itself, east of the Sierras, close to the town of Bishop, California, if you know where that is, south of Mammoth Mountain ski area. And the students were not only responsible for doing all the labor on the ranch, but also for doing all the labor in the kitchen. In other words, they not only raised the beef, to take one example, but they also slaughtered the cows, they butchered the meat, they cooked the meals, they did KP when the meals were done, they ran the library, they ran the bookstore, they were in control of the curriculum back in 1917. He said, I'm not going to run a college like this that has so much emphasis on what students do, unless they are also helping to run the entire place. And so this was way ahead of his time, over a century ago. I want students to be on the board of trustees, to take responsibility along with the other trustees to deciding what this college is and how it should work. Now, Nunn's consuming interest was leadership. I think he was probably saying, in effect, I've done great things with my life as a generally self-educated person, and I want to create a school that would enable other people to do great things with their lives too. But his interest gravitated more and more in the direction of ethical education. And so Nunn's curriculum, he wanted ethical leaders, in other words. So his curriculum was designed on this philosophy. I'm going to take the brightest students I can possibly get. And Deep Springs, by the way, has their students' qualifications in terms of standard test scores and so forth are equivalent to Caltech and Harvard. It remains, after all these years, a 2-year school because it's so small you can't have enough faculty there to offer majors. So it's a liberal arts and sciences, 2 years of intensive study. And the study is based on the philosophy that take these bright students, give them all the information they can possibly consume on whatever issue it is you're studying, and then give them access to all the different arguments about what would be the right thing with regard to U.S. tax policy or foreign policy or anything else you can think of. So they get the full range of views about what would be the best thing to do. And then, pardon my French, get the hell out of the way and let these students try to figure out for themselves what's the best policy on every issue that they studied. And his assumption was this, and I think it's very valid, and I've based my whole teaching career on the same thing, that if you are given responsibility to decide for yourself what's the right thing to do, then you're going to own the answer. And this not only means that you have a higher stake in supporting your conclusions, but it also means that you are unconsciously empowered to change your mind if you get more information or hear better arguments. And so this was and is the philosophy of education at Deep Springs. And it flourished for many years, and it has had 9 lives like the proverbial cat. When I went to Deep Springs as a student in the fall of 1956, the place was in dreadful shape, to tell you the truth. I was still absolutely excited to be there. But after 2 years, they finally hired somebody who was going to be the president to finally lead Deep Springs back to the kind of educational vitality it deserved. And what they discovered, what the trustees concluded that, and what we as students discovered when I was going back for my second year, was that they had hired a John Birch Society ultra right-wing philosopher. And so we came back that fall, all of the students, the new ones as well as my class that was coming back, and we were faced with a human being who was obviously all set to begin to indoctrinate us with the answers that he had for what he thought was the right policy with regard to foreign policy, economic policy, and everything else. So the students right away began to say, none, by the way, was at Deep Springs for about 2 years, and then his tuberculosis had advanced to the point that he was unable to be there. So he moved to Los Angeles and ended up giving the college a kind of constitution in that he carried on a very active correspondence with the student body, telling them what their responsibilities were and instructing them or correcting them if he felt that they were making a grave error in changing the educational philosophy of the place. And so these letters of none are contained in the Gray Book. And every student who goes there is given a copy of the Gray Book, and probably you read it carefully before you even apply to the college, because you want to know when you're applying to some place as different as this what you're getting yourself into. So right away we had a huge conflict between the philosophy of education we knew none believed in and a new president who was prepared to indoctrinate us by canceling all the guest speakers that we invited to come to the college the previous year and replacing them with right-wing speakers like one of the locals here, Cleon Skousen. And so we carried on throughout my entire second year at Deep Springs, the students, a very active campaign to try to convince the trustees they'd made a grave mistake. And we left the college at the end of our second year and went on to our education elsewhere, having no idea whether we had succeeded or not. We were quite frustrated. As an historian who has written the history of Deep Springs, and by the way, I'll pass this around so you can have a look at it. This is a biography that I've written of L.L. Nunn, which then morphs into the history of the college. The idea being what happens to a visionary's ideas. He was a social visionary as well as a technical visionary when they're turned over to very considerably lesser people. So his trustees carried on with Deep Springs and ended up being the ones, he appointed them for life, ended up being the ones who hired William E. Fort, the right-wing leader of Deep Springs that I told you about. I'll pass this around. So when I was doing the research for this book, I'm trying to figure out what was really going on behind the scenes during my student days there, and I find that the trustees had actually become convinced that the students were right and that they had made a grave mistake, but they didn't want us to know about it. Didn't want us to have the satisfaction of having convinced them. So within about 6 months, he was fired and another president was brought in, and we tried to get Deep Springs back on track. But suffice to say, it's a good example of how empowered the students are, because we believed, and students are called the beneficial owners of the college. That's in the founder's language himself. We were led to believe that he was taking the college away from us, that really belonged to us and to the philosophy that we had been imbued with, and that he had no right whatever to do that. So talking about student power a long time ago, and none had set up the equation to make that kind of thing possible. So now just another word or two about Deep Springs. I went on to graduate school, and by about 1979, I had already come, by the way, as Dean of Undergraduate Education at the University of Utah. Deep Springs was considering coeducation. It had been founded as a college for promising young men. So in 1979, a group of alumni, including myself, started trying to convince the trustees that this was important to the educational mission of the college, and that the college would be far better if it admitted women, and it would be far more consistent with its philosophy of preparing leaders for the future. It took 40 years for us to succeed at that effort, and I'm pleased to tell you that Deep Springs this year has its first class of women as well as men. 40 years. So when my students get restless and still tell me change is coming far too slowly, I said, you got to be patient. Sometimes it takes a long, long time. I would hasten to point out, however, that it only took 30 years to convince the trustees. It took nearly a decade to work its way through the courts, because there were alumni who challenged the decision to become a coeducational, and it went all the way to the California Supreme Court before we finally got authorization to go ahead with the decision that the trustees had made. So that's Deep Springs College. Way out on the edge in terms of its physical location, even more so in terms of its educational philosophy. Its size, by the way, I haven't told you yet, I've been holding this back. 30 students, 15 per class, and a faculty of 4 regular faculty in science, humanities, social science, and the arts, and about a half a dozen visiting faculty at any time who are professors on sabbatical, recently retired, young faculty who are just finishing writing their doctoral dissertations. But it is an experiment that is way out there, and one of the things that pleases me most about my association with Deep Springs, we talk about the importance of biodiversity in the natural world, that it is the outliers, it is those animals that are struggling on the remote niches of the environment that preserve much of the DNA that's important to adaptation for the future. Well, in the same way, I view Deep Springs educational philosophy and its practices as being as important to education because of its diverse philosophy and approach as biodiversity is in the natural world. Now, I had originally gone to Deep Springs as president by taking a 3-year leave of absence without pay from the University of Utah to go do that. I had long been an advocate, by the way, that Deep Springs needed leaders who would stay longer than that in order to get it, it was in trouble again, by the way, in order to get it back on track. So I agreed to go there for 3 years, and then anticipated coming back to the U and resuming my teaching career here. And at the end of 3 years, we were having a lot of fun at Deep Springs. We were seeing a lot of promise that we could get this place back on track again. And so when my department here said, what's your wish for your teaching assignment next fall, the Deep Springs trustees were saying to me, you're not going to leave us now, are you? We're just getting this thing going. So Linda and I, in the winter of 1999, had to make a decision as to whether we would come back and resume our lives in Salt Lake City and my career here, or whether we would remain at Deep Springs and keep working on the project there. As you can probably tell, the place was so unique and so energetic that the decision didn't turn out to be that hard. I resigned my professorship at the University of Utah and agreed to a 6-year contract to remain for nearly a decade at Deep Springs. Now, I've always been very democratic with a small d in my philosophy of education and my philosophy, my social philosophy. I believe in equality of opportunity. And the one thing that troubled me about Deep Springs was that it was for a very elite group of students. So while we were driving back to Deep Springs, I had just read an article in the 1997 issue of Harper's Magazine about what Earl Shores was doing in New York to teach humanities to people who were down and out in society, in New York City in particular in his case. And I was so inspired by his efforts there of providing full-blown humanities college courses to students who could never be admitted to a college at their current stage of learning, that I said to Linda, whenever I'm done paying my dues whenever I'm done leading Deep Springs, it's time for me to pay my dues at the other end of the spectrum of privilege. And so when I did leave Deep Springs in the summer of 2004, the first thing on my mind, it had been there a long time, was how am I going to get started a kind of course comparable to what Earl Shores, the founder of the project in New York called the Clemente Course that Steve had mentioned in introducing me. So things turned out this way. I landed in Salt Lake City wondering what I was going to do next. I was 66, but still ready to tie into something important and exciting. And two things happened. And one, that Marty Bradley was the Dean of Undergraduate Studies, and no, she was Dean of Humanities, Marty Bradley was Dean of Honors at the time. And she said, Jack, remember those courses you were teaching before you left to go to Deep Springs? I said, yeah, I remember them well. She said, would you do something like that in the Honors College? So right away I got tied into the Honors College again and loved it. But at the same time, my friend Gene Chaney, who was the Associate Director of the Utah Humanities Council, called me up and said, Jack, I've got an idea, and you have time for lunch. We were casual friends before that, and I said yes, of course, so we went out to lunch. And she began to tell me about Earl Shores' experiment with teaching humanities to people who were down and out in New York. And I lit up, and the more she talked, the more she saw my response. And she said, you must know something about this already. And I said, well, I read the article in Harper's Magazine 8 years ago about his teaching there, and I'm absolutely smitten with it. And she dropped her shoulders and her hands, and she said, Jack, I have just got a large grant for us to start a course on that same model here in Salt Lake City. Would you be interested in teaming up with me? Wow. Talk about pure serendipity, pure luck. So the venture course in the humanities, we chose not to call it the Clemente Course here, which, as I was telling Steve, is named for Roberto Clemente. But the reason the course was called that in New York is because it was taught in the Clemente Center, which is a large social resource center in downtown New York. So we thought, well, naming it Clemente here would make less sense. Maybe we need to have our own name. So we came up with Venture. And that became the name of the course, which 5 of us, Gene Chaney, myself, Jeff Metcalf, and 2 others, teamed up. And we had the pure pleasure of just dreaming up what would a 2-semester humanities course for people who have long since given up any hope of being able to attend an institution of higher learning. How could we conceive of this? Where would we teach it? Every question was open for us to decide, but we had a grant to do it, to figure it out. So the 5 of us began meeting at the Salt Lake Roasting Company, a little worn-out table in the corner down there, and scheming about what this course might look like. And here's what we came up with. A course that we began teaching in 2005, September that year. It had 5 components, reflecting the interests of the 5 of us who founded the course. And it was to render 4 hours of academic credit, both in the fall and in the spring. So any student who took this composite course in 5 humanities areas, it would end up with 8 hours of humanities course on the transcript. Come back to that in a moment. The 5 areas and we took these directly from Earl Shorris, by the way, in New York. Art history, philosophy, American history, writing, and what did I leave out? History, art history, philosophy, writing, and literature, primarily poetry. And so we conceived of a way we could put these 5 different parts of the curriculum together and coordinate in teaching it throughout the year. And then where were the students going to come from? So we went to the homeless shelters. We went to the food kitchens. We went to some of the ethnic centers downtown, ethnic support centers, and we said, we want to offer this course, and can you help us get the word out just to adult students? We wanted people who were generally in middle age, who had given up any chance earlier of being able to go to college and now had a desire to learn. And the old Humanities building, which was an old storefront down close to West High, we put a banner all the way across the front of that old brick building that said, "Free college course, inquire within." And it's in an area where a lot of people, homeless and others, were walking by. So all of a sudden, by September that year, even late August, we had 23 students lined up. And all they had to do was be able to demonstrate to us that they could read a newspaper with reasonable comprehension, that they could write a page explaining why they would like to take this course, and agree to stick with it for 2 semesters. If they would do that, we were ready to accept these students and work with them. So how did we start the course? The library was still relatively new at that time, the main library downtown. And so we said, well, why don't we meet at the base of the long ramp that leads to the roof garden, and we can introduce each other. We can all slap a name tag on ourselves, and then we'll walk up this ramp all the way to the roof. And when we're up there, we'll sit down. I don't know how many of you might have been on the roof of the main library, but it's something. And then we would talk about our dream for what we might do together during the coming academic year. And so we divided up, and we did this, by the way, for a decade with little variation. So one of us would give a talk on the fact that if you look around you, you can see the perimeter of the valley 360 degrees, and imagine what's beyond these mountains in every direction. So we talked about expanding one's awareness and understanding of the world and welcoming knowledge from the globe, not just from where we happen to be. Then another one of the faculty would stand up and say, and we happen to be on the top of a great repository of knowledge, the city library. The things that we want to know, the sources of knowledge, are in these computers below us. They're in the massive collections of books below us. And we're going to be drawing on these to extend our understanding around the world. And then we would all just sit around in a big circle and talk about why we signed up for the course. The faculty, we would take our turns talking about why we decided we wanted to teach the course, and all the students had a chance to say, well, my life has seemed like a dead end for a long time, and I have just thought that I would love to go to school and expand my horizons, and all of a sudden this chance popped up. They told me about it at the homeless shelter, and so here I am. You can't imagine how quickly the students and faculty bonded and began to care about each other. Where did we teach the course? At the Horizonte Center downtown, close to public transportation. They gave us their library every Tuesday and Thursday night, and we scheduled the class between 6 and 8 p.m. on those nights, so that those students who did have jobs would be able to get there and still get home, and those who were parents. By the way, we arranged, with the help of the grant, to have child care right there in the Horizonte Center, so that those with children could come and take care of them. Who were our students? For the whole decade that the 5 of us taught this together, women overwhelmingly signed up more than men. One year it was relatively close, but most of the years it was probably 2/3 and sometimes 3/4 women who signed up. Remarkable when you think about it, because many of the women were single parents, and they were somehow juggling, in some cases, jobs, in other cases, trying to take care of these kids, and adding this course to their life's responsibilities and burdens. And the men who signed up generally didn't have nearly as many things going on. Women, believe me, are courageous when it comes to gripping what's happening to them and wanting to do something to improve their lives. The men and women were all inspiring that we taught through the course, but I would say on the whole, the women led the way. And I find this, by the way, in my honors courses at the University of Utah today. When we approach controversial subjects in the classes that I teach, and it's hard to get kind of to prime the pump and get students to engage in the conversation. More often than not, it's the 18-year-old women rather than the 18-year-old men who are willing to stick their necks out. I am just amazed at what I'm seeing, but we certainly saw this in the venture course. And now they're seeing it at Deep Springs for the first time this year, as I've just said. So the objective that we had in mind, and we were also able to build on what Earl Shorrock had done in New York about this. He said, I believe that exposure to great ideas, liberty, justice, beauty, equality, and being able to engage the philosophers and historians and others who have written about these, enable anyone to get out of our shell and to realize that there are great ideas that can direct our lives. They can change our aspirations, and they can move us. And that's the hope behind the curriculum and the whole effort in Clemente and in Venture. As far as what we hope would come out of it, two things relatively simple. One is that some of them might develop the confidence to say, yes, I am a college-worthy student and I'm going to continue with my education. The other would be that they would say in any of a number of ways, you know what, I can take control of my life and I'm going to do it. And this means I'm going to crank up the courage and go get a job that I felt so unable to apply for or to consider myself worthy of getting a decent job that I haven't even tried. I can do it. And people resigning dead-end jobs and saying, I'm worthy of a job that has a future, that challenges my talents, that causes me to stretch. Either of those two things, we said, if those happen with our students, and we're going to monitor what happens to our students as best we can, we'll consider any effort we put into this more than satisfactory. One thing we didn't anticipate as the years went by and we began to look at what the students did do is the number of students who had found nonprofit organizations. And it started with simple things like the walking school bus. How many of you know what a walking school bus is? At least one of you does. Two of you do. A walking school bus is a bunch of parents that get together in one neighborhood and say it's fairly far and maybe not too safe for our children to walk across all these streets between home and school. And so in our neighborhood, we're going to get the children together every morning and we'll take turns as parents walking them to school. So there's a parent with them that can help to shepherd them through any dangers that might lurk along the way between home and school. So the venture students were among the first that I'd ever heard of to say, hey, we're going to have a walking school bus in our neighborhood. I'm going to organize this. We can do it. And community gardens. A student in the very first class we taught that first year, 2005-06, had some gardening experience. And she said, there's a vacant lot right next to my house. I'm going to get my neighbors together. We're going to grow vegetables. We can do this. And lo and behold, she's done it, and she's still running the nonprofit that she started now nearly 12 years ago. So empowering people to believe in themselves because they've been able to appreciate great ideas and noble examples around them. So American history was my part of what I taught in Venture. And and by the way, the whole spirit of this thing, of those of us who founded it, was we got to take some chances ourselves. And suddenly decided that you're going to teach students very different than any that we'd ever taught at the University of Utah or Westminster College or elsewhere, was enough to kind of make you think, am I up to this? Can I do it or not? And in my case, I'm an historian of higher education, and I had not taught American history since I was just fresh out of grad school. And so when we were talking about who will teach what, I said, I want to teach American history because I haven't done it for 3 or 4 decades, and this is going to be risky for me, because I'm going to have to bone up and find out everything that's changed about what we know about history and jump in. So I told my students the first night that first year, I said, I haven't done this for a long time. We're going to talk about American history, and I'm sticking my neck out, and you stuck your neck out just to enroll in this, so let's go to it. Now, because the overwhelming majority of these students were people of color and refugees, there were language barriers, lots of difficulties in terms of preparedness to take a college course. And one of our commitments was we're going to give them the real stuff. We're not going to dilute the content. If they're going to take a college course, we want them to know what a college course is like. And we want them to embrace the whole of these ideas and the beauty of these ideas, not some watered down facsimile thereof. So one of the books that I chose for American history was, how could I be temperate? The People's History of the United States. The author being, how could I have possibly forgotten this? Anyway, yeah, Howard Zinn. Thank you. So Howard Zinn's book is a very frank look at the experience of people who were not generally included in American history texts. And so I was wondering, what's the effect going to be on students of reading about some of the extremely severe life experiences and experiences as Americans of people just like them. But nonetheless, I thought, this is the content that they have to know. This is content we all need to know, by the way. And so we flew into this. And what I discovered was that it didn't destroy their interest in America or their pride in American ideals. It multiplied their pride. So we had students who would say, after reading about several chapters on the experience of black people in America and the civil rights movement and so forth, students in their journals would be writing about the fact that they had no idea how terrible the conditions were that many of their ancestors had experienced, or how inspiring the words of Martin Luther King Jr. were. They said, we'd been exposed to the letter from the Birmingham jail, but we had no idea the context, the power, the courage that was required, the wisdom that went into writing anything as inspirational as that. So what surprised me as much as anything in the American history was knowing the full American history, and by the way, getting comments from a lot of students saying, why in the world were we never taught anything like this when we were in high school? Why does the truth come out now? And are other students getting the same kind of broad approach to American history, or are they getting something that resembles the whitewashed over version that were so typical in high school classes? Now I'll give you one fun example of a student in one of my classes. We were talking about the effects of war on civilization, particularly the effects of war on common people. And so I gave the students an assignment. There are still people who are alive who were adults during World War II, and or at least growing up during that period. There are more of them if we include that. So you need to find someone in your family, you need to find somebody in your neighborhood, in your church, wherever you are, that experienced this, and interview a couple of them and get them talking about what it was like to wonder if your dad was going to come back from the South Pacific, to wonder if the war would ever be won, and what would happen if it didn't, and what was happening even if we won, and all of these questions. And then the students were to write about this and come and we'd talk about it the next week. So the next week rolls around, and Ben, who is about 45 to 50, I would say, serving as a bartender in a bar downtown, when it came his turn, he turned to the other students and he said, I didn't really have a chance to do the assignment because I didn't have any time this week to do it. But he said, there are a couple of old veterans who come into my bar every afternoon about 4 and nurse a couple of beers for a couple of hours. And so I thought, I'm going to find out about them. So he asked these 2 old gentlemen when they came in the next day, are you veterans, military service? And it turned out they both were, and they both served in World War II. And so he pumped them for all he was worth. So he apologizes in class and says, so I didn't really do the assignment, but I can tell you a little bit about, and what I wrote about, my experience with these 2 old guys. It was brilliant. And the students were so gripped by Ben's report that they gave their own with additional flourish. Now, what happens to venture students? So one objective was, would they go on to college? At the end of the year, our first year group, and we said, well, if you're interested in going on to college, we can help you get scholarships, we can help you apply. A lot of these processes are not familiar to you, and so we're here to help. Several of them talked with us about it. None of them said, okay, I'm going to apply at the University of Utah or SLIC or wherever. And we continued to encourage. The next year, about halfway through the year, we were still having a great time with the new batch of students, and one of those from the previous year came to us, and she said, I'm going to go for it, and if you can help me, I'm going to apply to the University of Utah in film studies, and I'm going to need a scholarship. And we said, there's need-based scholarships, we'll help you. So Judy enrolled at the University of Utah, graduated in 4 years flat. And she was having such obvious joy in what she was doing that this was beginning to spread among the other students that she had been with the previous year. And so by the time we arrive at the end of the second year, we've got 3 other students from that first year who say, well, if Judy can do it, by golly, I can too. And this inspired at least 3 from the second year class to say, I'm ready. I want to do it as well. So now we look back over more than a dozen years of experience with the venture students, and probably a third of them have pursued higher education in one fashion or another. And they're hard to keep track of. They're still a relatively mobile group, and so many of them were in Salt Lake City for a time. They've moved on elsewhere, but we do our level best to stay in touch with them. So here is a fun little story, which doesn't reflect well on our esteemed institution. 3 of us out of the 5 were faculty at the University of Utah. So we went to an unnamed friend at the University of Utah who was in that part of the machinery, and we said, we've got this course and we need an institution of higher learning basically to agree that this will be adopted as part of the university insofar as the credits these students earn will end up on a University of Utah transcript. It has to be recorded somewhere. They have to get started. I've never heard so many excuses in all my life. Well, these students would not meet our admission standards. We said, exactly right, that's the whole idea. We're trying to get them ready so they would. Well, if we admitted these students, then others would have to be admitted into the same class. And we said, well, that kind of defeats the purpose too. We don't want to crush their self-confidence right when we're trying to build it. Just give us a year to work with these students and they'll be ready, believe me. Well, we got those arguments and a bunch of others. So Bridget Newell, no relation to me, was a philosopher at Westminster College who was one of the 5 of us. And I turned to Bridget after we were talking about our loss in appealing for University of Utah support, and I said, Bridget, I'll bet Westminster College will jump at the chance to do this. Why don't you ask them? And she said, oh, I'd been hoping you'd ask. Let's do. So she called the rest of us the next day or sent us an email and said, Westminster is delighted to partner with us in making this project possible. And so they did. And now before I invite your questions, I'll just say one or two more things, like jumping ahead for coeducation at Deep Springs. The grant finally ran out after over 10 years, and we had been working with Westminster College all along so that they would be able to just take this program and absorb it themselves, assign their own faculty to teach it, and it would keep right on going. And by the way, the second grant that we got for the latter 6 years, the requirement was we needed to spawn 2 more of these elsewhere in Utah. And so we worked with faculty at Weber State and in Ogden, and they developed a venture based on the same model as ours with its own variations, and the same thing at Southern Utah University in Cedar City. So about 3 years ago, we turned this whole project over to Westminster College, and they were genuinely delighted to have it. And then I don't know whether you're aware or not, but they had a massive budget cut, and last in, first out, so they ran the program 1 year and had to say it breaks our heart, but venture is over. We hope to be able to restart it, and believe me, I know they do hope to restart it, but they haven't been able to do it yet. So one of my lessons from working on the edges of academe in experimental modes is you're not always sure these things are going to last, but you can surely take pride in the fact that we affected, on an average, 25 students a year for 12 years. So that's over 300 students altogether. Got this kind of an educational start. Half of them are probably carrying on or have carried on already to a genuine college degree, and most of the rest have changed their self-perceptions and said, I can do more than I'm doing. I'll welcome your questions.
Very short time for questions.
Jill.
We're supposed to end at 1 o'clock.
We got 2 minutes. Go ahead, Jill.
I'm curious, who was the art history professor when you were teaching?
Hikmet Lowe. She's written the book on spiral jetty more recently. Yeah. Yes, indeed. Please.
Do you see any future similar activities?
For the venture course? Yes. On the other hand, I'll give a quick answer to this, which is really substantive. The 5 of us who got together to do this, I call a wild organization. And that is, we had a grant, we had ideas, and we had the esprit of inventing something. And we were not a part of the University of Utah or anybody else. And so we could just go down there to the Salt Lake Roasting Company and dream. And then we could act. Those who have to begin programs like this, as they did at Weber and down at Southern Utah University, both of those, by the way, have run into trouble too, is that it's not fun to do this inside a bureaucracy, which drags its feet all the time. These experiments need freedom in order to flourish. And so one thing that I agonize over as a professor of higher education who's always thinking about how do we make our institutions more flexible is our bureaucracies get thicker and thicker at all institutions of higher learning, particularly large ones like this. And how do you keep the kind of a spirit that we were able to generate among ourselves alive in an institution that has so many rules? I don't know. Please.
Has any analysis been done on the combination of the students that you did have versus equivalent type of people that didn't do it, what they ended up, were they, one group went this way, one group, you know what I'm trying to say? What happened to the people who didn't, who were equivalent?
Yeah. We don't have any study of students who might have signed up for venture but didn't. But one thing that is clear is that people who are willing to take this kind of chance have a little spark, something that's inexplicable, that says, yeah, I'm going to take a chance on that. It's intimidating as it can be, but I'm going to do it. Results at Deep Springs, by the way, same question can be asked there. It's very hard to get a comparable group. But Deep Springs has now turned out 9 Truman Scholars, 3 Rhodes Scholars. This is from a student body of 30 each year. 3 Rhodes Scholars, 2 members of Congress, one of my students there from when I was teaching an ethics and leadership course similar to what I do here in the Honors College. At the age of 38, just got elected, flipping the 3rd District in New Jersey, a Korean immigrant family. These students believe in themselves. They believe, having slaughtered cattle, milked cows, run libraries, worked on the admissions committee, they believe they can get things done. And that's the biggest outcome that I see from a Deep Springs education. I don't know whether I answered your question or not. But
Kind of, you know, as best you could.
as best I can. Okay, thanks. I thank you all. You've been good listeners, and thank you.